The hospital was never a place she imagined being part of her story. It always seemed distant, cold, reserved for other people, other lives, other realities. But on that day, without warning, it became the center of everything. She entered holding a folder of medical records, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to maintain her composure, but there was something in the air that already indicated that this would not be an ordinary day. The white corridors seemed longer than they should be, and the sound of the healthcare professionals' footsteps echoed strangely, as if each movement had a different weight. The doctor called her. She sat before him with a slight, nervous smile, trying to believe that it was all just a routine checkup. Maybe an unimportant abnormal test result. Maybe an unnecessary worry. Maybe something simple. But the doctor's silence before speaking already said a lot. He took a deep breath, looked at the exams one more time, and then began to explain carefully. Technical words, measured steps. But no technical word can soften certain realities. The diagnosis came in. And it didn't come as a loud shock. Came as a blackout. For a few seconds she heard everything but understood nothing. The words seemed distant, as if they came from another environment, another world, another life. It was as if her body were present, but her mind had drifted away. Treatment. Possibilities. Follow-up. Everything was mixed together without any sense. Until a single truth began to form within her. Something had changed forever. She nodded automatically, without knowing exactly what she was agreeing to. She rose from the chair with a strange feeling of lightness, as if she were not fully connected to her own body. And then he left the room. It was at that moment that reality began to crumble. The hallway looked the same, but she wasn't the same anymore. People passed by her talking, walking, going about their routines. But she couldn't keep up with that pace. He sat down on a nearby bench, almost without realizing it. And he stayed there. Property. Her gaze was lost on the white floor. That's when the tears came. It wasn't immediate. It was built up. It was as if everything that had been held back until that moment had finally found a way out. The tears flowed silently. Uncontrolled but also silent. It was a restrained cry, almost respectful of the surrounding environment, as if even the pain was trying not to disturb. Inside her, her thoughts swirled endlessly. Is this happening to me? And now? And what about everything I planned? The dreams began to appear in fragments. Small flashes of a life that seemed stable just minutes ago. Work plans, travel, simple goals. Nothing too grand, but everything important enough to give meaning to the days. Now everything seemed distant, fragile, uncertain. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air didn't seem to go in properly. Her chest was tight in a way she had never felt before. It wasn't just sadness. It was the feeling of anticipated loss. As if something were still there but were already leaving. She picked up her cell phone, her hands still trembling. He thought about calling someone. For anyone. But when she opened her contact list, she realized she didn't know what to say. There weren't enough organized words to explain something she herself couldn't understand. He turned off the device. And he put it back. Hours later, he was already in a hospital room. The white walls, the characteristic smell of a hospital, the distant sounds of the corridors. Everything there seemed to reinforce one feeling. Life had changed stages without asking permission. She remained silent, looking at the ceiling, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. Night fell slowly, and with that came the most difficult moment. The silence in the room intensified. The small sounds of the machines beside the bed seemed louder than they should have been. Each beep sounded like a constant reminder that something had changed in her body, and in her life. She turned to the side. He closed his eyes. But he couldn't sleep. Because the silence was not empty. It was too crowded. And within him the thoughts grew stronger. What if there is no way out? What if this is the beginning of the end? What if I never go back to being who I was? The tears returned. Even quieter. Deeper. More difficult to contain. She pressed the pillow against her face to muffle the sound of her own crying. She didn't want anyone to hear. She didn't want to be seen in that state. But in that room alone, there was no longer any need to hide anything. The pain simply existed. And it took up everything. Until sometime in the early morning something changed. Not in the environment, but in it. The silence remained the same. The room remained unchanged. But there was a different feeling in the air. Something she couldn't name. It wasn't a physical presence. It wasn't sound. It was just a perception. As if, amidst all that seemed empty, there was something that hadn't gone away. She opened her eyes. And he remained silent. The room was the same. But for the first time, the silence didn't seem completely empty. And that scared her. And it calmed her down too. She whispered almost voicelessly, "I don't know how I'm going to go on." And the silence did not answer. But he also didn't leave her alone like before. The early morning hours seemed to have lost their meaning inside that hospital. Time no longer followed a clear line. It dragged on, folded in on itself, becoming something difficult to measure. Each minute seemed longer than it should be. And yet, the hours passed without her noticing. She was lying down, but she wasn't resting. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the white ceiling of the room, as if she could find some answer there that had not yet been spoken in words. The diagnosis remained vivid within her, not as a distant memory, but as something present.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you will receive 3 special bonuses today: the ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Constant repetitive. Treatment. Follow-up. Possibilities. But none of those words could change the central fact. Something had been broken that morning. She turned to the side slowly. The sheet was cold. The room was silent. But it was not a light silence. It was a profound silence. Full of thoughts. Full of fear. Full of possibilities she didn't want to imagine. And it was in that silence that the mind began to speak louder than ever. First came the memories. Life before the hospital now seemed like a different existence. Not something distant in time, but distant in feeling. As if she belonged to another version of herself. Little things started to appear in my mind. Wake up without rushing. Simple conversations. Small but safe plans. Things she hadn't valued before, but which now seemed too precious. Each memory came with a different weight. And each weight was a reminder of what had been lost that day. She closed her eyes tightly. But that didn't help. Because within it, thought did not need sight to continue. He simply existed. Is there still a future for me? This question arose without an answer. And he stayed there, repeating, repeating, repeating. The body was tired, but the mind wouldn't stop. It was as if her inner self was at war with the silence itself. And the quieter the room became, the louder everything inside it got. She took a deep breath. Once. But the air didn't seem to fill his chest completely. There was a constant feeling of tightness, as if something invisible was pressing from the inside. She turned her face towards the window. Outside the night was deep. No stars visible. No movement. No apparent life. Everything seemed to be at a standstill. And that only increased the feeling of isolation. But then something subtle happened. Something almost imperceptible. There was no change in the environment. There was no new sound. But the way she perceived the space around her began to change. It was as if the emptiness was no longer absolute. It was as if there was something she couldn't identify, but also couldn't ignore. She opened her eyes again. The room remained the same. But now there was a strange feeling of companionship in the silence. Not a physical presence. Not a voice. Not a form. Just a perception. And that made her uneasy. I'm imagining things, he thought. But even so, the feeling didn't go away. She pulled the sheet tighter. He closed his eyes again. He tried to convince himself that it was just tiredness. It was just fear. That was just the impact of the diagnosis. But something inside her wouldn't accept such a simple explanation. The hours continued to pass. The early morning hours slowly approached. The hospital remained almost motionless, as if suspended in a state between sleep and wakefulness. And inside the room she remained awake. Not just physically awake, but emotionally exposed. It was then, at some point deep in the night, that something began to change inside her. Not abruptly, not clearly, but like a small crack in a wall that previously seemed completely sealed. A new thought emerged. Almost shy. What if this isn't the end? She opened her eyes immediately, as if he had been frightened by his own idea. Because until then, she hadn't allowed that possibility. Everything inside her had been dominated by fear. But that little idea, it wasn't fear. It was something else. She took another deep breath, and he realized something important. Even amidst all of that, she was still breathing. I was still feeling it. He was still conscious. It was still there. And that, however small, meant something. The tears returned. But now they were different. Less desperate. Quieter. Deeper. As if something inside her was beginning to release what had been trapped. She pressed the pillow against her chest. And for the first time that night, he didn't try to run away from his own thoughts. She allowed them to exist. Fear. Pain. Uncertainty. But also, a small opening. It's still a fragile possibility. She whispered almost voicelessly. I don't know how, but I'm still here. And at that moment, the silence in the room seemed different. Not empty. Not oppressive. Just a gift. As if he were listening. The early morning hours were beginning to fade when the first sign of dawn appeared without fanfare. It wasn't something immediate. There was no abrupt change. Just a slight difference in the tone of the darkness, almost imperceptible, as if the world were slowly remembering that day still existed. Inside the room she was still awake. The body was tired. Heavy eyes. But something inside her was no longer the same as the night before. She remained lying there in silence. Not that suffocating silence of the early evening, but a different kind of silence. Less heavy. Less aggressive. Almost bearable. The diagnosis was still there. Nothing had changed in the outside world. No news had been reversed. No new answers had emerged. But inside something had shifted. She took a deep breath. And he understood this more clearly than before. She was still here. I could still feel it. I was still thinking. Still existed. And that, somehow, seemed more important than anything else at that moment. She turned her face slightly towards the window. The sky was beginning to lighten. A soft shade of blue was beginning to replace the black of the night. He was discreet. Almost shy. But it was real. And this simple change in the world outside triggered something within her. It wasn't a happy occasion. It wasn't an instant emotional cure. It was something simpler. As if for the first time in a long time. His mind had stopped racing in circles for a few seconds. She closed her eyes again. And he let the silence exist without resistance. And it was in this calmer inner space that something began to reorganize itself within her. The thoughts were still there. The fear still existed. The insecurity had not disappeared. But now there was.
If you wish to deepen your knowledge of Jesus, the Gospels, and the Christian life, I have prepared a complete guide that can help you on your faith journey. In addition to the main guide, you will receive 3 special bonuses today. The ebook, The Lost Parables, the Gospel Study Journal, and the guide, The Hebrew Mindset. If you found this content helpful, click the first link in the description to learn more. I hope this material helps you further understand Christ's message and strengthen your spiritual journey.
Something else as well. A slight resistance. A small internal presence that wasn't there the previous night. She didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know what to name it. But I felt it. It was as if, amidst everything that seemed to be crumbling, something inside her had remained standing. Something quiet. Something invisible. Something firm. She placed her hand on her chest. He felt his own heart beating. This is it. Constant. Real. And that made her realize something simple, yet profound. She was still alive. Not just biologically, but present. Inches. Here. The tears returned. But not like before. They were no longer just tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. Of understanding. Something that didn't need to be fully explained to be felt. She took a deep breath. And this time the air seemed to enter more easily. Not because the problem had disappeared. But that's because she was no longer fighting against everything at once. There was a new space inside her. Fragile. But it exists. And in that space, an idea began to take shape. Not as a certainty. Not as a promise. But as a possibility. Maybe I can keep going. A little at a time. She opened her eyes. And he looked out the window again. The morning light was now brighter. The room no longer looked the same as the night before. Not because the place had changed. But that's because she had changed the way she saw him. The silence continued there. But he was no longer an enemy. It was just silence. And that made all the difference. She sat down slowly on the bed. The body was still weak. The fatigue was still present. But there was a small internal movement that hadn't existed before. One direction. Even if it's minimal. She looked at her own hands. The same hands that had trembled with fear the night before were now just there. She didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what the treatment would be like. I didn't know what the next few days would bring. But, for the first time since the diagnosis, this uncertainty didn't feel like nothing but destruction. Seemed like a path. She took another deep breath. And then he whispered in a calm, almost broken but distinct voice. I still don't understand. But I'll try to continue. The silence around them offered no answer. But he didn't crush her either. He just stood there, following along, present. And somehow that was enough. Because in that hospital room, where everything seemed to have begun with loss, something new had emerged. Not a cure. Not a final answer. But a silent force. Invisible. Constant. And for the first time she understood. Not all hope arrives as a miracle. Some arrive as a simple breath of fresh air to keep going.